It's 12 o'clock. It's the first Friday of the month. So the first Friday of every month, we will be covering our car forms. Any questions that you have, any information that I have, we'll roll these in when we have the car forms updates and all sorts of things, which we get those car forms updates twice a year, usually in June and December. So we'll roll those in as well. But the goal here is I'll be checking in with our transaction coordinator and our transaction team in the office, see if they've got things that they're noticing are filled out incorrectly on a regular basis, what I'm getting questions on, and just what I think might be useful in addition to any specific questions that you have. Crystal hopped on this morning, and well, technically it was this morning. It's now this afternoon, but it was this morning when you hopped on. So I'm not wrong there. And asked about the assumed financing addendum. So if you are writing an offer on a property where the buyer is going to attempt to assume the financing on it. Okay, then what we want to include with that, or include with the counter offer, or whatever point this comes up, is our AFA form, which is our assumed financing addendum. The top of this form, you should be able to see it on the screen. I can probably enlarge this a little bit to make it bigger. Sometimes I forget that I should do this, but there you go. The assumed financing addendum, the top is filled out just like any other form. It defaults to the purchase agreement, or you would reference a seller counter offer or a buyer counter offer and what number it is, or other form. The date of that form, which is the date that's pre-printed in the upper left-hand corner of that form. So not the date that it's signed or the date that it was agreed to, but the actual printed date on the form. If you're referencing a form that doesn't have that printed date on it, it would be the date that it was signed. Property known as, that's where you're going to put in that full address. Okay, now keep in mind too, because since we're covering car forms, I'll mention this. Make sure to put on that full address, not just the number and the street, but also put that suffix, that drive, court, road, whatever it might be, because there is often like 123 sample street and 123 sample court. So it's important to have that suffix. Then you're going to put in buyers' names and sellers' names. Buyers and sellers are referred to as parties. Number one is the agreement is contingent. So we're adding a contingency to the contract stating that it's contingent upon the buyer obtaining the assumption below. The buyer's approval of the assumed financing, buyer shall act diligently and in good faith to obtain the designated financing. Okay, so that's just always included with this assumed financing addendum. We're adding that contingency in. 2 is seller shall, within 5 days is the default. We can always check that box and change it, but the default is within 5 days after acceptance, request from lender, and upon receipt, provide to buyer copies of all applicable notes, deeds of trust, loan balances, and current interest rates. Any difference between estimated and actual loan balances shall be adjusted at close of escrow by cash down payment. Impound accounts, if any, shall be assigned and charged to buyer and credited to seller. So it's saying, hey, within 5 days, seller needs to request this and provide those copies to the buyer. Okay, so I would probably leave that at 5. I might shorten it to 3. If you've already received them, then that's fabulous. We don't have to worry about that. If you've already heard from the seller and the seller says, hey, the lender said it's going to take us a week to get all the documents from them once we have a buyer in place. If you want to assume the financing, then adjust that to accommodate what the buyer or what the seller already knows. But otherwise, I'd probably leave it at 5 or even shorten it up to like 3. I'm surprised this here is days after acceptance, not business days, but do keep that in mind because lenders don't work on weekends. So if we had 5 days on there, acceptance happens on Friday, which is day 0. Then day 1 and day 2 is Saturday, Sunday. They're not going to make any progress with those lenders on Saturday and Sunday. So just take that into account as well. It is not business days. It's just days after acceptance. Okay, so that's number 2. So that again, default, it just sets up that that's in the contract. Number 3 is an if clause. So if this assumption is an assumption of a VA loan. VA loans are different than FHA or conventional or agricultural or USDA. They're different than any other type of financing because the person who purchased the home to secure the VA financing had a VA eligibility. Okay. So this is saying, hey, if it's an assumption of a VA loan, the sale is contingent upon the seller being provided a release of liability and substitution of eligibility unless otherwise agreed to in writing. Okay, seller is advised to carefully investigate the substitution of eligibility along with proper documentation to determine whether seller will be able to obtain another VA loan prior to this assumed loan being paid off. So the default on a VA loan is if I assume the VA loan from Jake, Jake's eligibility is not reinstated. I am holding up his eligibility to be able to use his VA loan to purchase forward. So that is the default. This assumed financing addendum states that, hey, we don't care what the default is. The default on this is I'm going to he's going to get a release of liability and substitution of eligibility. Okay. Generally speaking, as far as I know, the only way to get a substitution of his eligibility, not saying that he is VA or that he has a VA loan, but just using him as an example, um, is for me to be eligible for a VA financing and me to assign my eligibility to Jake as part of assuming his loan. So I'm assuming his loan as the seller and I'm assigning my eligibility for him. If I'm not VA, I can't do that. Okay, there's no possibility of that. So oftentimes that VA eligibility is not reinstated. But if that's the case and it's not going to be reinstated, keep in mind that we need to have that in writing as part of like an addendum to the assumed financing addendum. So I would have an AD form referencing the AFA form. Okay, so keep that in mind that this is set up that we're going to reinstate the eligibility if it's a VA loan. If it's not a VA loan, we don't have to worry about number 3. Okay. Number 4 is, it has 2 parts, 4A and 4B. A is within 17 days or blank days after acceptance. So the default is 17 days. Buyer shall, as specified in the agreement, remove this contingency or cancel the agreement. However, if the assumed loan documents are not provided to buyer within 7 days after acceptance, buyer has 5 days after receipt of these documents or time specified in the first sentence of the paragraph, whichever occurs last, to remove this contingency or cancel the agreement. So that's A is, hey, there's a time frame where you need to remove this contingency. 4B is an or. Okay, if we check the box for 4B, then 4A is no longer a valid statement. It would be 4B, which is the assumed loan contingency shall remain in effect until the assumption is approved. I would probably personally check the box for 4B every time I submitted this form. Just letting them know that, hey, we want this assumed loan contingency in effect until the assumption is approved. Now, technically, if we're assuming financing, we're disclosing that we're assuming financing. The assumption of that financing or the eligibility and approval of assuming that financing should ultimately fall underneath our loan contingency. But I feel like there could be some gray area there. So I would probably check the box for 4B. Okay. Signing below, everybody acknowledges they read, understand, and agreed to the terms. Any questions? Crystal, did I answer your questions regarding the assumed financing addendum?
Yeah, thank you. I didn't know what it looked like and I kind of wanted to get walked through it. Thank you.
Absolutely. This isn't one that we see a lot. I would imagine that most people that have done assumed financing probably didn't include this form with their offer either, because a lot of people don't know that it existed. It was something that came out, well, it was revised last June. But yeah,
I just
absolutely.
keep seeing a bunch of assumable loans pop up, so I kind of wanted to know what that was about.
Yeah. So, right. If you've never closed on one before, keep in mind that assumed financing, most of those transactions are going to take a longer period of time. Last I heard, it was taking somewhere between 60 and 90 days to receive the approval of the assumption of financing. But it is where you get to assume the existing financing on the house. Buyer would either need to come in with the down payment to make up the difference between the loan balance and whatever that purchase price is, or they could also couple with it. There's probably some lenders that would throw like a second loan on there as well, like a home equity loan, something that would fall in that second place position to help cover that gap, depending on what it is. The assumption, right? Assuming financing could really put the buyer in a positive spot because that's going to hopefully put them at a lower interest rate than maybe what they could get today. That's the benefit to the buyer. If I'm doing a $600,000 purchase and I can do $400,000 of that at 3.25% instead of 6.25%, my payment's going to be substantially different, even if I put a second loan with that. So it's a great benefit to the buyers as long as we can reach an agreement with everyone. Again, the pieces that are going to fall into place there is, does the buyer have the cash to make up the difference, or can they obtain a loan to make up the difference between the purchase price and the loan value? And again, if it's a VA loan, which most assumable loans are VA, just so you know, is that eligibility portion of it. Is the seller going to want their eligibility reinstated? And are we going to be a eligible buyer, or if they don't have eligibility available to them to substitute? So those are kind of the caveats that come into play. Most of our conventional financing, our FHA financing, has a non-assumable clause that you sign and agree to when you obtain that loan. So most of the assumption loans out there are VA loans. Any other
Perfect. Thank
questions
you.
on? Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions on other forms or with when it comes to assumed financing? Alrighty. The other thing that I was going to cover today, if nobody had questions, is I was going to walk you through forms that I would personally want to be included in my buyer transactions. So I know this is something a lot of people have questions about. It changes occasionally, but let's talk about the buyer related forms. So obviously, we're going to start with that buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. That form, in fact, let's go ahead and pop over. We'll open the edit screen. I should have just stayed in there. But that form has some forms attached to it. That's usually what we're going to start with, right? As soon as we're showing properties to a buyer or having those conversations about them purchasing a home, we want to make them our um clients, right? We don't just want to work for free. Not only that, but based on our settlement, we're supposed to have this signed as soon as possible once we establish that relationship. This form does establish that agency relationship. So of course, the first form here is our agency disclosure. Just because a buyer signs our agency disclosure here with the buyer representation and broker compensation form does not mean that they're not going to need to sign it again once you write an offer. This form's also attached to our residential purchase agreement. Don't skip it. Have them sign it again. It's just disclosing the different types of ways they can be represented in a transaction. Then we have our BRBC, or Buyer Representation and Broker Compensation Agreement, and there's a few other forms attached to this one which are important. Our first one is our buyer investigation advisory, just talking about the different types of investigation a buyer can do. So again, we're not going to skip these forms when they sign that BRBC. They also need to sign these forms as well. And these forms come back into play again. You'll see them oftentimes with that residential purchase agreement. We also have our broker compensation advisory. Okay, there's the seller's portion of it, which is 1, and then the buyer portion, which is number 2. Doesn't mean that we don't cover what's in section 1 with our buyers. We can still go over that, make sure they understand what's in there, but our main focus is going to be the section 2 for our buyers. Okay. Sellers paying the compensation, right? Number 3 is when enlisting real estate brokers to represent them. Buyers agree to pay the buyer's broker when escrow closes. but the person responsible for the payment may be negotiated in the transaction. So again, you've section 3 covers, hey, what happens if the buyer pays compensation? What happens if the seller pays compensation? And are there practices that it just talks about the fact that we've been changing practices with how that's offered and who's paying and everything based on the NAR settlements. So that form's in there as well. The possible representation of more than one buyer or seller disclosure and consent is also part of that BRBC. And the California Consumer Privacy Act advisory, disclosure, and notice. Okay, so those are all part of that BRBC form. We don't have to add them separately. They all get signed along with that BRBC form. I do recommend that you do spend some time. I've gone through these forms in detail. You can look up previous trainings, but take some time to read these forms for yourself. Most agents, I would say, the majority, don't ever take the time to actually know and understand these forms. You don't need to go over them line for line with your buyers, but you do need to be able to explain what is with, what's going on in each form to your buyers and sellers so that they understand it. Okay, so that's your first form that I would always include with my buyer transactions. Now, linked to the BRBC form, not just included, but the ones that are also referenced, there's 2 additional forms. One is, let me find it, the buyer, identification of preferences and priorities. So if I was setting up my template, I would have these forms in that template. And then I gotta find it. It talks about, I'm not seeing it in here. Give me just a second. We're gonna add a form in there. So if once I'm inside the edit, if I just click the add button up top, it allows me to access the car forms libraries. And we're looking for, I thought I had this already, the Buyer Financial and Personal Information Form, the BFPI. So I would have my buyers fill out these forms as well with the BRBC. Okay, your buyer identification of preferences and priorities just talks about, hey, what is the type of home that this buyer's looking for? Do you have to hand this form over to your buyers and have them check the boxes and fill it out? Absolutely not. I wouldn't do it that way. I would do this in my buyer consultation. We'd be having a conversation about what it is that they're looking for. Are they looking to buy a primary residence, second home, investment property, right? Is it for a relative? What price range, right? Are they looking for a triplex, fourplex, condo, right? Manufactured home, pre-owned, new construction? Kind of nail down what it is that they're looking for. Property features are all listed in there, locations, and then other. Okay. I think this is a good way just to make sure you've checked all those boxes, that you've asked the questions and gotten to the basis of what it is that they think that they want. Okay, it doesn't lock them in there. It just keeps it in line with what it is that you're searching for them. And this form is referenced in our BRBC form. Okay, so if you want to see where that's at, it's in our grid. So I'm back on the BRBC. And in the grid here, it talks about, hey, buyer preferences and priorities. It's not defaulted to be included, but I think it's a great form to make sure that you're having those conversations with your buyer to obtain clarification and clarity on what it is that they're looking for. So I usually check that box and include that form. Okay. The other form that is referenced on here is our buyer financing and personal information form. And that's down here in section G1. It's defaulted to be included. So time to deliver buyer personal financial information is within 5 days from the execution of this agreement. So you could take this next form, attach it to this, send it home with them and have them get it back to you. Or you could have them fill it out right there with the BRBC during your buyer consultation appointment. The buyer financial information and personal information form, the BFPI, is really important because this is outlining like, hey, how much deposit do you have available? It's helping us to have these conversations ahead of time. You don't have to slide this across the table and have them fill it out if you don't want to. Again, this can just be part of that consultative appointment that you're having with your BRBC and that buyer consultation, asking the questions that, hey, when we write an offer for a property and your offer gets accepted, the seller's going to require a good faith deposit. Okay, that's something that's due within generally 3 business days of an accepted offer. Based on where they're looking, you've already filled out the buyer identification of preferences and priorities. You know where they're looking to buy. You should know what the average deposit is in those areas. It varies depending on what area you're writing offers in or what areas they're looking for. You could say, hey, the average deposit is 1% in Solano County. To be competitive, you might want to make it more. If your price range, because we've filled out that buyer identification of preferences and priorities, your price range is up to $800,000. Do you have $8,000 available in liquid funds that you would be able to give to the title company who will hold those funds for you as a neutral party within 3 days of acceptance, right? Good conversation to have because sometimes we have those buyers, you go to write the offer and you're like, okay, I'm going to put a deposit of $8,000. And they're like, $8,000? I don't have $8,000 available to hand over. When do I have to have that? I was going to pull it out of my retirement account or I was going to, right? So you get all these questions. The other thing is a good thing to mention is that that deposit needs to be available in an account that their lender has record of if they're obtaining a loan, right? So it's good to have these conversations. Perfect. How much down payment do you have available? Okay. Where are those sources coming from? Is it savings? Is it, gift? Do we need a gift letter? Is their lender going to allow that? Right. So this allows us to get that information. Is it coming from a sale of an existing property? Additional funds available for broker compensation and closing costs? Source of additional funds, maximum loan amount they're comfortable with, who's their lender, are they pre-qualified, pre-approved, or fully underwritten? What kind of financing are they doing? Are they doing a 1031 exchange? Do they have an expected inheritance? Here, what's their personal information? Do they currently rent? Do they own? What's their property ownership experience? It's got great information on this form. We should be going over this or at least getting this information from our buyers. And technically, again, it is part of the BRBC. So if you're not getting this form filled out and it's checked on your BRBC, then it's a breach of your BRBC for them to not turn this in. So just heads up on that. So I would make sure before we even start looking at properties, these are the 3 forms. Any questions on these 3 forms? All right. In addition to this, some other forms that I like to include are, let's see, one of the other forms that's listed with our BRBC and on the residential purchase agreement is our buyer material issues for a specific property. So that form, I know a lot of people don't get, but I would probably provide a copy of this to my buyers anytime we write an offer for a property or maybe give them a copy just so they're aware that it exists with the BRBC. And then anytime we have an accepted offer, I would get them a copy of this form. This form allows your buyer to write down if they have any questions for the seller, if they have concerns about a property, right? It allows them to put those questions or concerns in their own words so that I'm not taking their phone call, transcribing what it is that I think they're asking of the seller and then asking the seller. This allows us to take specific buyer questions, present them to the listing agent for the seller to answer so that we're not putting it in our own words. We're taking the buyer's actual words, presenting those to the sellers and getting those answers from the sellers specifically. So I think this is a good form. It is mentioned, like I said, and I think both the BRBC and in the residential purchase agreement that the buyer can make sure that they put all of their questions or concerns in writing. This is the form to be able to do so. So I think it's a good form to make sure that our buyers have a copy of and that they're presented with a couple times during that transaction. Okay, so I like to have this one in my template. so that it's always included. Um, some other forms that you may want to include. I was trying to see if there's anything that needs to be done with our. Oh, another one that you may want to include. So there's two more forms that I would probably include with my BRBC, just because it's first point of contact. The first one is going to be the market conditions advisory. The second would be the statewide buyer and seller advisory. The reasons that I like to do those earlier than when we're writing an offer is by the time we've written the offer, it's probably really too late to include these forms. Hold on. We're trying to get the statewide buyer and seller to add. The market, yeah, anytime a offer is accepted, Crystal, for the BMISP, the buyer material issues for a specific property, anytime, even if a buyer has questions about that property prior to writing the offer, you could technically, because okay, anytime they have questions about a property, you can use this form, because on the top of this form, the buyer material issues, the BMISP, states that it's between you and them, so it's between the brokerage and the buyer, and it's pursuant to that buyer representation agreement. Buyer has made or is contemplating making an offer to purchase or is already in contract on a property described as blank, parcel number situated in county of, and buyer, the following are material issues to buyer regarding the property specified above. So it's at any point the buyer has interest in a property, you could utilize this form to get their questions answered by a seller. At any point. Doesn't even have to be accepted. Yep. Perfect. All right. The other forms, like I said, buyer, the market conditions advisory, I would include, because it just talks about, hey, the market is cyclical. There's ups and downs. Our job as their agent is to make recommendations, to provide them with the information, but ultimately what they decide to offer on a property is up to them. It also talks about non-contingent offers, loan contingencies, appraisal contingencies, investigation contingencies, insurance, multiple offers. This is where you find that clause about making multiple offers at the same time and the dangers of doing so. And so I think this is a really good form to provide before they're ready to write an offer on a property. So if they have time to review this information, ingest it, ask any questions that they might have, and make sure that they understand what their role is in this transaction. Okay, so this is one of those forms. It doesn't have a specific address or anything on it. And it's just good information for them to have prior to them writing an offer on a property. Before we were in the habit of doing the BRBCs all the time, the buyer representation agreements, I always made sure to provide this with the offer, but it's good to do it ahead of time. I usually gave them a copy of it as well when we sat down for our buyer consultation. The other form that falls in line with this market conditions advisory is the statewide buyer and seller advisory. This again outlines what the buyer's rights and duties are once they enter into contract on a property. It talks about the seller's rights and duties, the broker's rights and duties, and then is 15 pages of different types of investigations that they can do on a property that they enter into contract on or that they're thinking about buying. So this gets them thinking ahead of time about what they should be paying attention to when looking at properties. Okay, so I think this one's also good to have read prior to us entering into contract on a property or signing an offer even, because it's 15 pages long. It's a lot of information, and they should be thinking about this ahead of time. By the time we're entering into contract on a property, the ball's already rolling on our investigation contingency. So really sorting through this, thinking about this, and making choices is kind of goes out the window at that point. So I'd have this ahead of time. So those are probably the number, like the top forms that I would include with that BRBC portion of it at time that we start seeing properties, to prepare a buyer in advance for making that offer. Now, at the same time they're doing the BRBC, I'm probably going to provide them copies of some of the other forms they're going to see during the transaction, a copy of the offer, a copy of some of these other forms that I'm going to talk about. But that way they're aware of kind of what's coming up. We want to prepare them so that they feel educated. They feel like they know what's coming. They can get questions answered ahead of time. They can review the offer document ahead of time so that when we actually go to fill it out to make an offer, they've already gotten most of their questions answered. They know what's in that form. Any questions so far? All right. So other forms that I like to make sure that are included to my buyer as part of my purchase transactions. Obviously, we're going to have the residential purchase agreement. So that's in here somewhere. Our residential purchase agreement is in there. With the residential purchase agreement, if they haven't signed that market conditions advisory and statewide buyer and seller advisory, I usually include that at that time. If they've already signed those two forms ahead of time, then it's not necessary to have them sign it again. I'm also going to include the wildfire disaster advisory. Hold on, we're just waiting for it to add. The wildfire disaster advisory, it's not the fire hardening one, it's not the super in-depth one, but the wildfire disaster advisory just states that, hey, we live in an area. There could be, let's wait, there could be wildfires in this area, or there's a history of wildfires in this area. It may be difficult to obtain insurance. You should look into your insurance at the very beginning of the transaction, right? So we're just drawing their attention to the fact that there could be wildfires. Um, we're just going to wait patiently for forms to come back online. There we go. So that is the wildfire disaster advisory. Again, it's just one of those that I think is good to provide at time of offer or even before that. So give it just a second here. It's going to open up. My forms is angry at me currently. There we go. Our wildfire disaster advisories, concerns and issues with wildfires in the area, buyer advisories, right? Check in to see if you're able to obtain insurance, make sure that your satisfaction of your concerns about the intended use of the property, right? So all of that's in there. I think it's good information to include to all buyers. The other form is a for your protection, get a home inspection. Now this would get marked. It's usually included on our VA and our FHA purchases, but there's no reason that it shouldn't be included on our regular conventional home purchases as well. Talking about that, hey, you should, for your protection, get a home inspection. Okay, again, it's required for FHA transactions, but it can be signed by everyone. Talking about what is a home inspection, be an informed buyer, what's included, how to find an inspector, appraisals are not home inspection, and then there's other radon gas testing and other health and safety issues that aren't covered. So it just talks about this, right? So it's a good way to get it out there because we're going to advise them to get that home inspection. This is just putting it in official form that, hey, get a home inspection. Okay, so I like this form for all of my buyers as well. Another form I like for all of my buyers, and these don't necessarily have to be done. Those first couple, the wildfire disaster advisory, because it talks about, hey, go get your insurance right away. For your protection, get a home inspection. That one, get their brain thinking about that ahead of time. That can also go out with your BRBC or during that consultation, the buyer consultation. Another one that they should be aware of, which, I've talked about occasionally, I should probably talk about it more, is your notice of your supplemental property tax bill. Now, I did a full training on this, walking you through how to figure out what that supplemental property tax bill is going to be. But the supplemental property tax bill can end up being a large, big ticket item for our buyers. This form makes them aware of this. It's also talked about in the natural hazard zone disclosure, the NHD report. Our buyers probably aren't looking through that whole document. I'm just being honest. I would make sure that they're aware of this. I would also probably go on to either talk to the title company after you're in contract on a property and ask them if they can tell you what the approximate supplemental property tax is. Or one of the tools that I like to use to track down what this is, and like I said, I did a really in-depth training on it, is Property ID. It's one of our NHD providers. Their website has a free supplemental property tax calculator. So you plug in, if you create a free account with them, you can go resources, supplemental property taxes, fill in the property address, the closing date, and it'll actually kind of calculate and give an estimate of what that supplemental property tax bill is going to look like for your buyers. So this makes them aware of that supplemental property tax bill. So I like this form as well. Notice this one is property specific. So this one is one that I would probably do after we're in contract on it, but we would have talked about this prior to. This is one of those things that should be covered during our buyer consultation. Let's see, there's also a buyer homeowner insurance advisory that you could include. This is kind of talked about a little bit in the wildfire disaster advisory, which is part of the reason I like that form. But there is a separate form for the buyer homeowner insurance advisory. We're just waiting for it to add in. Hold on. Right? The importance of obtaining property insurance in the purchase contract terms, California's property insurance market, insurance conditions, resources, and broker recommendations. So this is just, it is getting harder and harder to obtain insurance, to find reasonable costing insurance. It used to be really inexpensive, and now it keeps getting more and more expensive, especially if you live in the country or near trees, right? In those high fire or very high fire hazard severity zones. So it's getting harder and harder to obtain even in town. So super good information on insurance. I would rather over disclose to my potential buyers or to my buyers than under disclose. I would rather go over all of this, have them sign a couple extra forms to make sure they're aware of something, than leave myself open for a, well, you never told me about that type conversation. I do think that you should talk about that homeowner's insurance as part of your buyer consultation. Because once we're in contract on a property, just sending these forms out for a signature really isn't enough. You want to be, I know that like DocuSign and Authentisign are great tools. It allows us to do those e-signatures, which are signed electronically. But part of that comes with the fact that now we're not going over as much with our potential buyers or with our buyers as they're writing offers. So we need to make sure that they understand what it is that they're signing. Make sure that they, hey, just so you know, I'm sending over your offer for signatures. Along with the offer are the next are forms, right? Call them up and have that conversation with them. Send it over to them in a text message. Even put together, like if we know we're going to include these 5 forms with our offer, you can, have an email that covers, please pay attention to these forms, or here's the important points in addition to, like, take time to read each form. Please call me if you have questions, right? Make sure that they know that you're open to that discussion if you're not going to call them and go over it with them over the phone when we're sending out those electronic signatures. I can't express how important that is, that we're having those conversations with our clients. All right, let's see here. The other one that we have now is the new form that came out in December, the Realtor Acknowledgement and Disclosure. And that one talks about the benefits of going with a realtor versus just a real estate agent, right? Somebody who's a member of the National Association of Realtors, and in turn, the California Association of Realtors and the Solano Association, the Northern Solano Association of Realtors, or whatever local association you belong to. But this talks about what value is it to choose a realtor over just a real estate agent. And it discloses whether you are or aren't one. And then it also talks about, hey, are we getting compensation, or are we sending compensation to somebody else? That referral, that's the disclosure of a referral source. So this gets filled out as well as part of that. Why is that important? Well, we already talked about why, this talks about the benefits of being a realtor or choosing a realtor versus a real estate agent. And it's important to know whether we're getting or giving compensation to somebody else because it might affect the amount that you're willing to receive as compensation from a buyer. So it might affect whatever you've negotiated with your buyer or how you're negotiating with a potential seller, okay, the amount. So that's why it gets disclosed. It was a new thing that came out in December. So this form, I would recommend including it. Kara, you're on today. Are we requiring this like for our Zillow transactions and such?
Which one is it?
The
Hold on.
RAD form, the realtor acknowledgement and disclosure of the referral fee.
I believe we are.
Okay.
Not for Zillow, not considering that Zillow is like a referral that we're paying Zillow. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
Yeah, no.
Okay. But for regular referral transactions.
Correct.
Okay. So yeah. So fill it out. And if you're not receiving a referral fee, then we just don't check the box for section 3. And as far as compensation from multiple sources or referral fee received or paid to another broker, we just leave those blank. We're just filling out that top section disclosing that we're a realtor. There is a separate form it's got a 2023 date that's just the realtor acknowledgement form that just says that you are a realtor. So you could use that one instead of this one if you don't have any referral fees. But this also is just disclosing that, hey, no, I'm not receiving compensation or paying anybody as part of this transaction. So it could be beneficial as well. So that's your realtor acknowledgement and disclosure. Some other forms that I like to include as part of the transaction. So generally these next ones are one is at the very beginning. In fact, it's not in here. So let me see if I can add it in. I like to send out through Glide. I was like, what is that program? Glide, the buyer inspection elections. And that investigation elections. That one is a fabulous form. It just says that, hey, as a buyer, I'm interested in the following investigations. Okay, I like to send it out through through Glide versus through zip forms, only because when we send it out through Glide, it's going to break it down just like it does for a seller of just a couple at a time. Like, hey, yeah, I'm going to investigate with a general home inspection, insurability and wood destroying pests, right? Or yeah, I'm interested in checking to see if there's got asbestos. Because they check something on here, it doesn't hold them to it. It just gives us our launching pad of a conversation around what separate investigations they're going to have, what might be covered under like a home inspection or what they might see on a preliminary title report from the title company. So it allows us to have those conversations with our buyers. So I usually do send this out through Glide, the buyer investigation elections. And then with that form,
And that is super important. And that has helped me in situations. So a lot of times we'll see now the sellers getting the inspections done ahead of time. And even if they're getting them done ahead of time, we still want to make sure that we go through and ask the buyer if they would like to have those inspections done again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Which is where the next two forms, so I do two. One is the buyer investigation waiver, and one is the receipt for reports. So hold on. I probably should close out of the editor and reopen it. I think it's because I've got so many documents added in and I'm sharing my screen. So our buyer investigation waiver, anytime I've got a buyer, there's usually like 5 investigations that I recommend just as blanket recommendations. Okay. Home inspection, pest inspection, roof inspection, sewer lateral inspection, and HVAC. Okay. Most houses have an HVAC system. I'm going to recommend those 5 inspections. Now, if there's a chimney or a fireplace, I'm going to recommend a chimney inspection. If there's a pool, I'm going to recommend a pool inspection or anything else that's unique to that property that, like I had a property that backed a hillside. It was a really big hillside. We had somebody come out and investigate that hillside, right? Or if there's trees leaning over the property, we may want to recommend that they have an arborist come out and inspect the trees for the health of those trees, right? Make sure they're not come crashing down on the house. So it's our job as their agent to think about things and make those recommendations. It's their choices if they do it or not. But again, I always do home, pest, roof, sewer lateral, and HVAC. And then the rest depending on what the house has. Okay. So I usually do this buyer investigation waiver. Okay, states that, hey, home inspection waivers, broker recommends they obtain a home inspection. If they've decided not to, they initial this spot here for 3A. 3B is for the wood destroying pest inspection, if they decide not to do one of those. And then C is where we list any other. So this is where I would list the HVAC, the sewer lateral, and the roof if they decided not to do those. Okay, it just says, hey, broker recommends buyer obtain an inspection for the following items. So I'm going to list the rest of those investigations. And if there's any of those they've chosen not to, they're going to initial that they decided not to do those investigations. This covers me, right? This says that, hey, buyer, I'm recommending these investigations. It's already set up with the home, the pest inspections there. And then I would fill in those other few inspections on those lines so that they understand that, hey, I recommended these and you chose not to do them. Okay. Now, waivers of additional investigations recommended by other reports is section 4. So you can fill this form out more than one time. You can come back and revisit it. So if I had a general home inspection and they said, oh man, like the panel's questionable, you should have an electrician come out and look at it. Then we could say, hey, there was recommendation for further inspection by this report, dated blank, right? So we can fill in those line items if anybody recommended further investigation. If they chose not to do those, if they're like, it's fine, I'm good, they initial that, hey, we recommend that you obtain those and you've chosen not to, they initial. Okay, buyer signs that. So I like this form because it documents what I recommended and whether the buyers decided to do it or not. So buyer investigation waiver goes out with all of my buyer transactions. Okay, the other thing that I like is our receipt for reports form. So there's a couple different ways that you can acknowledge reports received. We can have our buyers sign the first page of every report. I think that's tedious and long and cumbersome. I like the receipt for reports because it puts it all in one place. And it also provides a spot not just for the reports that, or did they split it? I believe this form, I'm going to double check, provides a spot for reports they received from the seller or from another transaction. Okay, so if this house was in contract before, another buyer ordered investigation reports, and we got copies of those, which we're supposed to because it's material disclosures, then we would get a copy of those reports, and I'm going to make sure that my buyer and seller knows that my buyer got a copy of those, but they weren't ordered by my buyer. If they were ordered by the seller, like Kara was saying just a little bit ago, we're going to disclose that those reports were ordered by the seller, or if they were ordered by my buyer. So receipt reports, you can have multiples of these in your transaction. Are the reports being provided by the buyer or the seller? Okay. So oftentimes we'll have one if there's reports provided by the seller. We have one of these forms for the seller and then one for whatever forms the buyer ordered. Reports not verified by broker or seller, and buyer's own investigations. Any reports not ordered by the buyer should not be considered as a substitute for buyer obtaining them or obtaining their own inspections, and reports covering the same items and any other matter affecting the value or desirability of the property, right? That's what Kara was talking about. Like if the seller orders a home inspection, we still recommend that they get another home inspection. And this is why right here, okay? A list of reports provided to buyer or seller that were ordered for this transaction. Were they ordered by the buyer or the seller? Okay. And then here in this next section is a list of reports from previous transactions. So this is where if that property was in contract already, we got reports. They weren't ordered by the seller. They weren't ordered by the current buyer, our buyer. They were ordered by another buyer. We put them down here on this bottom section. If the reports were delivered via link, we would identify here for all reports identified by a check below, buyer is unable or unwilling to open the link, is unable to download the documents in the link, or prefers to receive documents directly rather than via link. We would check that. But for the most part, most documents are going to be delivered via electronically. A lot of times we're using Disclosures.io or Home Light Listing Management for that. Okay. If any of the above reports recommends buyer obtain additional investigations, buyer should contact qualified experts to determine if such additional investigations are necessary. Buyer does not do so, they're acting against the broker's advice. Reports prepared for persons other than buyer, right? Buyer has been advised that if a buyer receives any report that has not been ordered by buyer, whether prepared by or for seller or others, buyer may have no recourse against the preparer or of the report for any errors, inaccuracies, or missing information. Buyer is advised to check with the preparer of any report to determine if preparer will offer buyer such recourse. Okay, so I like this form for all things reports and receipts, or receipts and reports for anything, because it just documents it. Okay. So that's usually what's included with my buyer files. Okay, if I'm going to set up a template, those are the forms that are going to be in my buyer template and things that I like to go over with my buyers. Obviously, in addition to our seller disclosures, like our NHD report or our seller property questionnaire, our transfer disclosure statements, our agent visual inspection reports. So all those are in addition to these, but these are kind of my blanket for every transaction, what I like my buyers to review and sign. Any questions on any of this information?
I have a question. I know you kind of talked about it through the whole process, but could you very, very briefly just skim through and say at what point you would give these to your buyer?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously buyer representation broker compensation form would be hopefully before we start showing properties or very close to when we start showing properties. That's the goal, that we're sitting down with our buyers and doing a consultation and getting that BRBC signed. Along with that, I would provide the buyer identification of preferences and priorities form, along with the buyer financial and personal information. Those two forms are referenced directly in that BRBC. So I like to include them as part of that. Or we would go over that information during our buyer consultation and have them sign that, yep, that's what I'm looking for. That's where the money's coming from. I would also probably go ahead and provide them with the buyer material issues for a specific property form, just so they had the copy of that. And if they have any specific questions regarding a property that they're interested in, that they can provide those questions in writing or concerns so that I can present them in the buyer's words to the seller to get those answers. And then also at that same time, I like the market conditions advisory, the statewide buyer and seller advisory, at that time as well. And I may go ahead and turn over at that same time, we'll probably talk about during our buyer consultation, the different types of investigations and inspections that can be done. So I might do the 4-year protection, get a home inspection at that same time, or I might do it at time of offer. Same thing at time of offer is our wildfire disaster advisory. Notice of your supplemental property tax bill. Normally, because I'm going to couple that with what the approximate or estimate of the supplemental property tax bill could be. Buyer's homeowners insurance advisory and that realtor acknowledgement and disclosure form. And then usually once we're in a contract, we would do the buyer inspection election. And then once we have any reports from the seller, that receipt for reports with those listed from the seller. And then once we've ordered reports, once buyer decides what investigations they want done, we would do the buyer investigation and another receipt for reports. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely. All right. Hopefully you guys found this training helpful. We'll be doing this once a month, first Friday of the month. It'll normally be at 11 o'clock because usually I think the Zillow meeting should be over by then. Oh, it just went away. Let's see. So we'll be covering that. We'll be back to our regular training on Tuesday. And if you guys have any questions or anything, feel free to reach out at any time. And if you want to go over any of these forms in detail, number one, I've gone over them a lot. If you go to the YouTube channel and search it, you can usually find it. But I'm happy to go over it with you. Or if you have questions when you're getting ready to fill it out, feel free to reach out to me or Kara or Ed, because we're happy to make sure that you're filling the forms out correctly instead of just guessing your way through it. We would rather take those phone calls and answer those questions with you at that time. All right. Fabulous.
Thanks, Amy.
Yeah, absolutely. Have a fabulous day. Next month, whatever questions you guys have, bring your forms questions with you or things that you're not understanding. And then I'll probably go over like what should be included in a seller file, just so you guys have that information as well. So we'll kind of come prepared for that as well. All right. We'll see you next week.